Welcome to the Iconic Podcast with me, Soon Yu, your host. The Iconic Podcast features candid conversations with successful Asian and AAPI leaders who share their personal journeys of challenges and triumphs. The Iconic Podcast is brought to you by the Asian American Foundation, by Gold House, and by the founders of the Asian Alumni Chapter of the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and is made possible through the generous support of Altos Ventures, whose offices also serve as the home of the Iconic Podcast.
When you lose that publicly after pouring your heart and soul and your entire person into a race, it is hard. It took me a couple months to bounce back. I mean, I just felt so empty and so defeated, and the public nature of it is also, really hard to deal with. It's one thing to run and win publicly. It's another thing to lose so publicly.
I'm super excited to welcome the mayor of Cincinnati, Aftab Pureval. And you and I met a few times actually, and they're actually related to the couple of sponsors we've had. I think you spoke at TAS Heritage Month a couple of months ago. And then we met, I think, at AAPI Lead, where all the elected officials got together of Asian heritage. And it was fantastic. And what my audience doesn't know is, because this is only by video or by audio, what a dramatic presence you have and the type of vibe you give when people meet you. I think you have this incredible smile and it's incredibly welcoming. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. Well, I feel very welcomed. The vibe on this podcast is already at a 10, so I'm so excited to be here. And look, thank you so much for creating opportunities and platforms for AANHPI folks across the country to be able to tell their story and talk about the fact that, our community is not just happy to be in this country. In many ways, we're leading this country. And so thank you so much for getting those stories out there.
Yeah, and I fully agree with you. I think we have great stories, and it's not wanting to be invited to the party in many ways. We're creating the party, right?
That's right. That's right.
Part of it is just inviting folks to learn about us and the great party that we're throwing. And just a little bit of background about you for our audience. You were elected with an historic margin. Basically, 2/3 of the city voted for you. And we'll go into this, but funny thing is, I think you were an accidental mayor. That wasn't, I think, initially your intent to run for mayor, and it just sort of happened. And you literally took 2/3 of the vote, which is incredible. Prior to that, you were at the Hamilton County clerk of courts. You were a corporate counsel, actually, for Procter & Gamble, and specifically with the Olay brand, which is really amazing. A couple other things about you is that you were recognized by Gold House, who's also one of our sponsors, for being one of the top 100 impactful Asian leaders in the country. And so amazing distinction. And, I've done a little research on you. And, when I sort of step back and think about sort of what you do, you're an incredible sort of advocate, promoter of the things that you believe in. You're more than just a cheerleader. You're actually really good at convincing and persuading people to take part or to participate or to get excited about things that obviously you care about. You're an amazing builder of coalitions. We're going to talk about some of the skills that you bring to that and how we can learn some of those skills. And I think the one thing I really love is the idea that you're an intentional leader. It's we'll talk about this idea of being intentional versus reluctant. And I actually think you're one of the most intentional leaders out there. And we'll talk about the power of that intentionality. But let's start at the beginning.
Podcast, my ego is going to be through the roof, man. This is just compliment after compliment. I screw up every single day as well, so hopefully we can talk about lessons learned and the mistakes that I've made, so other young leaders or established leaders can learn from it.
Well, you've just kind of seen through my guys. I really pump people up, and then I do go into the failures.
Then you tear us down. I love it. That's fine. I'm ready.
It's a diversion tactic, right? No, right. But let's talk about, you were born in Ohio. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yep. Okay. That's right.
But your story actually kind of begins before even Ohio. It kind of begins with your parents. And I think their experiences obviously helped shape who you are. If you could talk a little bit about how unique both your mom and your dad's experiences are, and the fact that they didn't meet in the U.S., they actually met way before that. And it was surprising actually that they even ever met.
It's based off of luck and God's will that I'm in this position, not just as mayor, but as an American citizen. What I'm struck by is how consistent my family has been in public service, even before we lived in this country. I as a first or second generation American, my family immigrated here to this country in 1980. I was born a couple of years later, and so as a result, I didn't necessarily have a very close relationship with my grandparents. My mother's from Tibet. My father's from India. My mother was born in Tibet. And in fact, when the communists invaded, my grandfather on my mother's side was a freedom fighter. There are actually books where his name is included because he was one of the leaders of the resistance. Oftentimes people think of Tibetans as passive, and we are pacifists. We do not believe in taking another person's life, but we do believe in self-defense. And so he was one of the Tibetans that took up arms to fight against the communists. And then on my paternal side, on my dad's side, my father's from Punjab. His father was a brigadier in the Indian military, rose up very high in rank. And so one of the things that I don't actually talk very much about, but that I'm always thinking about is in my family, service is just kind of part of what we do. And so even though I didn't have a close relationship with these grandparents of mine, that is a consistent theme through my life, almost by divine intervention. And so proud of their service, so honored to be part of their legacy. But you're right. My story really starts with my parents. As I mentioned, my mom born into Tibet, forced to flee when the communists took over. So my grandmother and my mom picked up and made their way through the Himalayas, through Nepal and into India, where she grew up in a southern Indian refugee camp called Bailakupe. Is near Mysore. She got an education, made it to college in Delhi, where she met my father, who is from Punjab, India. And they fell in love. And, it was kind of a big deal because my father from a military family, my mom from a refugee family, neither one of them shared culture, neither one of them shared religion, shared food, shared language, but their love kind of transcended all of those barriers. And despite some protests from within my family, both sides, they decided to not just get married, but then to come to the United States, where they didn't know very many people and had very little money. And they were like 25 when that happened. So when I think about where I was in life at the age of 25, I was nowhere near taking such a courageous and risky decision. I mean, I was learning how to do laundry at 25. I mean, it's just insane, the courage that it takes to do that. And when I reflect back on that, and talk to my father passed away when I was in law school. But when I talked to my mom about it, what strikes me is that my parents, even before they lived in America, even before they were themselves American, they believed in the American dream. They believed in the promise of this country. And so they took a risk, not to benefit themselves, excuse me, but to benefit their future children. And myself and my brother have continued to benefit every single day from that courageous and some would say insane decision to move from New Delhi, India to Beaver Creek, Ohio in 1980. And, like other new Americans, they faced racism, they faced oppression for sure. But what they also faced was welcoming and community. And they were able to build a life here in this country. And I'm fond of saying it, but it's true. This country time and time again has affirmed their decision to do that time and time again. And there are forces that are trying to destroy the American dream, are trying to take us backwards to a time where it's even harder for Black and brown people to succeed. And it's on all of us to make sure that that doesn't happen. And look, it's hard. The American dream is something you have to fight for, that promise, that opportunity. But I'm living proof that it's real, because in one generation, my family went from being refugees to now the mayor of a major American city. And that story only happens right here in this country. That's why my family and I, more than anything, are just so proud to be Americans.
Wow. There's so much to unpack with that. And multiple times where literally I was just goosebumps, right? When I think about and I've listened to other podcasts you've done, and I've listened to other interviews, but you never did talk about the idea that your parents were both what they did in terms of service, right? And the conviction they had in terms of providing service more to others, not just to themselves, but to others. And the courage and sacrifice to both marry outside of your so-called culture or race, right? To leave the country that you're most comfortable in and go to some place where there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of risk. That incredible service and conviction, I'm sure, has been a motivating factor for you in terms of the choices you've made. And we'll sort of, I want to want to talk a little bit about that too, as we talk about what was your motivation to actually run for office and all that. And I'm sure some of this fed into it, but I've also heard you talk about, and this is probably true for most Asian parents, they probably had different expectations when they came here in terms of what their kids would be doing. And running public office isn't front and center for most Asian parents. And so I'm sure that was quite a conversation you must have had with your family.
Yeah, look, I mean, the stereotypes are a stereotype because oftentimes they're true. And it was not, and I don't want to dwell on this. Obviously, I make jokes about it, but it's true that if my parents had their wish, I would have gone into medicine. But unbeknownst to them, they were the ones that kind of set me up for this path of service. I talked about my grandparents, but it's more about, well, first, let's talk about why that is. My parents weren't interested in me becoming a doctor solely for the prestige. I'm sure that's part of it, right? Getting to brag to their friends, etc. But I think it was the overwhelming thought was, man, when I moved to this country, I had to work my ass off. And like nothing was guaranteed, and it was hard, and there was risk all around me. And so when my parents thought, okay, what does a comfortable life look like for my sons? Whether it's doctor, lawyer, engineer, those professional paths were the paths of security, of financial stability, and of actually making it in this country. Because immigrant parents are just working all the time. I mean, when I was growing up, I would see my family in the morning and late in the evenings, and that's pretty much it. My dad was just constantly working. My mom as well, small business owner. And so I think it's less about prestige and more about security. But unbeknownst to them, when I reflect back on their story, all they did was take on risk, right? They, to your point, they took on risk to get married. They took on risk to come to this country. They took on risk every time they opened a small business, and they did that a lot. And so that coupled with the fact that my mom being a refugee and my father being really interested in current events and politics was kind of forming my worldview and what I wanted to do with my life and how I thought about risk, right? But yeah, they wanted me to have something more stable. They wanted me to have something that was secure. And, when I talked to them about running for office, they weren't necessarily wild about it. But they could see that I had that conviction that this was something that I felt fulfilled by. And ultimately, they were incredibly supportive. But it does stress them out. I mean, look, soon every time I run for re-election or an election, it's not guaranteed that I'm going to win. And so my mom is always kind of thinking about, okay, if you lose, how are you going to make money? How are you going to support your wife and your two kids? And look, if my kids decide to run for office in the future, I'm going to have a similar mindset, right? My first priority is going to make sure that they're okay. And that, if I pass on, I can rest easy that they're on a good trajectory and a good path, and that they don't have to go through what my parents went through, which was, kind of building from lower middle class up, and how much work that takes and how much racism I'm sure that they experienced.
I think what's really interesting is you kind of dabbled in the idea of running for office early on. And I think there's probably an inflection point where you said, well, maybe this is something I might want to do more than as a hobby, right? But let's talk about the period where there was something where you could still be a good student but and satisfy what your mom and dad probably had in terms of expectations, but also give you some experience and exposure to sort of something that you probably had some interest in. You started that early in high school when you ran for student body president. I think your campaign was known as Big, Brown, and Beautiful. So can you talk a little bit about being big, brown, and beautiful, even in high school, and how that translated in terms of being both different and how you identified yourself?
Yeah, so I'm going to be very honest on this podcast because I am thoroughly embarrassed by the Big, Brown, and Beautiful campaign slogan that I have. And I think about what was I thinking? Why on earth would I say something so self-aggrandizing when I was a kid? And I really think it comes down to the fact that as a kid, I was always torn between different worlds, right? I was half Tibetan and half Punjabi, and and yet I was born and raised in Beaver Creek, Ohio. So I had these three cultures that I was constantly trying to balance, and at the same time, I was just surrounded by white people, right? I mean, Beaver Creek back in the day was not as diverse as even it is now.
And Beaver Creek, so just so people understand, that's by Dayton, right? Basically,
yeah, suburb
of Dayton, right?
And so, I just, my parents struggled to a certain degree to assimilate, but even me as a natural born American really struggled with balancing those identities. And so, part of the reason I ran for student council or whatever it was early in life wasn't a genuine interest in helping and serving and in just generally leadership, but also it was an attempt for me to just fit in, right? Just to have some kind of niche, particularly in high school where it's really hard with all these cliques and whatnot to just feel like you fit in and belong. And so, in many ways, it was kind of a selfish endeavor for me to have a permanent role, if that makes any sense, to have like an actual space that I belong.
You belong. It's sort of the right of belonging. Yep.
Right. Exactly. And so that was the reason I ran in high school. That was, a big reason why I ran I was student body president at Ohio State. And Ohio State is massive. So that was a really good kind of learning experience for what real politics would be. And I'll be honest, because a lot of the reason I was doing these things was more selfish and less about service, that year as student body president, I had a terrible year. I was racked by anxiety. It was kind of the beginning of social media. Facebook had just come to Ohio State, and I was just getting so much hate online. I didn't know how to deal with it as a 20-year-old. I just kind of ignored it and just felt the pressure continue to build. And as a result, I actually didn't get as much stuff done when I was student body president as I was hoping to. And it really taught me a big lesson about, running for these offices, number one, for the right reason. Number two, when you're ready and mature enough to be able to handle public criticism, and having the experience and the tools to be able to distinguish between personal attacks and constructive feedback, the wheat from the chaff, if you will. And so after that experience, I kind of took some time off from politics because it just, I didn't feel like I was ready for it. And I'd grown so much from those negative experiences when I was student body president. And so I focused on law school. I got a good job out of law school and I was focused on that. And then, President Obama just kind of turned my world upside down. And so he really kind of reignited that passion, that flame, to raise your hand, step into the arena and try and serve your community. But I'm really grateful for those early experiences where I was running for things to kind of fit in and have a role rather than being guided by service and prioritizing others, because it really taught me the consequences, frankly, and the high stakes of taking on these roles without understanding, number one, what you're getting into, and number two, why you're doing it in the first place. Because, running for office and being elected, look, there are incredible moments, there are fulfilling moments, but ultimately it's really hard. It's really hard to balance my role as a father to two young boys and my role as a mayor, not to mention my role as a husband. And no one likes hearing politicians complain about it, but it's true. I mean, anyone with a demanding job knows how difficult that is. And it's not lost on me that I'm doing the two most important things that I'll ever do, being mayor and being a dad to a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. And so you really gotta want it. You really gotta be in it for the right reasons, because the sacrifices are real.
On the Iconic podcast, we really celebrate the idea of the hero's journey. And fortunately for us, one of our partner organizations is at the forefront of celebrating our great heroes and their stories. And that organization we work with is Gold House. Gold House is a cultural ecosystem that unites, invests, and champions Asian Pacific leaders to power tomorrow for all of us. To learn more, please visit goldhouse.org.
The American dream is something you have to fight for, that promise, that opportunity. But I'm living proof that it's real, because in one generation, my family went from being refugees to now the mayor of a major American city. And that story only happens right here in this country. That's why my family and I, more than anything, are just so proud to be Americans.
First, I just want to commend you and thank you for being courageous enough to share in full honesty. Because that's hard to say, and it just demonstrates how self-aware you are. You've become. Probably back then you weren't, right? But that you've become. In what was your true motivation in getting involved in student government, both in high school and in Ohio State? I find it really interesting for a couple of reasons. One, you did it for valid reasons. They weren't like invalid, right? I mean, we all in high school are trying to figure it out, right? And we would love to belong to as many cliques as possible, but that's not realistic. And we're more often than not welcomed. And so this idea of finding a place where you have some sense of belonging is so important in community, right? And a role too. Sometimes just having a role that's that you're wanted in the validation of that. And then I think what you said about your motivation of running in Ohio State and how you ran for the wrong reasons, all of that was sort of a wake-up call that this is not easy, and it's not. And if you do it for the wrong reasons, if anything, you probably would have been gun shy to ever run again. And yet, you mentioned this idea of being inspired by President Obama, and I think you even talked about what's in a name. Right? This idea that he had such a unique ethnic name. By the way, you definitely don't have a, simple Steve, Jim, whatever, name. And neither do I. So I fully appreciate and relate to this idea. But I think one of the things that you've been able to do is celebrate the idea that you are different. And actually, I even saw a little commercial ad social media post you guys did making fun of your name, Aftab, right? You even did the whole Aflac with the insurance company. It was wonderful. And you took something that potentially could be a negative and you made it into a positive, and you've really embraced that. Can you talk about this idea of two things? The second time you decided to go in, you went in intentionally, and you went in knowing all the pitfalls and all the things that could go wrong, plus all the sacrifice that it actually takes to be in that type of role. And then also, how did you actually be different and celebrate that, and at the same time build coalitions? Because I think at Cincinnati, there's very few Asians, as far as I understand. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. The decision to go back into it, really, I mean, I don't want to overstate it, and I know I'm wearing a tan suit like he got a lot of grief for, but it really was President Obama. Obviously he's a historic figure, our first Black president. But I really view him as our first president with an ethnic name. And, even when I was as a young person, thinking about one day running for office, I never thought it was possible given my name. And that's real. I mean, politics is all about manufacturing empathy with a stranger in minutes, right? If you meet someone, particularly at the local level, when you're not going to have enough money to be on TV, radio, digital, etc. So if you're knocking on doors or at a church festival or a community event and you meet this voter in front of you, this is probably the only time you're going to have to actually talk to them. This is probably the only time they're ever going to see you. And so you have under a minute to introduce yourself, put them at ease, and earn their vote. And you earn their vote by convincing them that you understand what their challenges are and you are going to fight for them. That's a lot to do for anybody in under a minute. But particularly if you don't look like them, if you don't have their religion or culture, if they can't pronounce your name, the obstacle for entry into politics is just even higher. And so I never really thought someone with my background and my name could find an electorate to support me. But President Obama really kind of flipped that around and convinced me that no matter what you look like or where you're from, if you want to serve, then it's on you to convince them that you're the right person. It's not the voter's fault. It's your lack of conviction or your lack of self-confidence or your lack of the ability to take on that risk. And so that convinced me to run. But running wasn't easy. In 2015, when I decided to run for office, Hamilton County was the county that I ran in, where Cincinnati was traditionally Republican. A majority of the countywide elected officials were all Republican. Now, the city itself was relatively Democratic, but even the city of Cincinnati was less Democratic than the city of Cleveland or the city of Columbus. You have to remember, we are the southernmost major city in Ohio and share a border with Kentucky. So culturally, we're a lot different than the rest of the state. And so the only reason I was able to run for countywide office as a nobody was because the office I was running for, no Democrat in their right mind would have run for that office because it was unwinnable, right? It was a 2-term Republican incumbent who couldn't be beaten, raising a lot of money, 100% name ID. And there was no sacrificial lamb. So when I raised my hand, the Democrats were like, sure, we'd love for you to run, right? You're cannon fodder.
You're crazy, but we love it.
Yeah, exactly. And they were trying to be helpful. And they would say, look, Mayor, the Democrats who have been successful in the past have been women with Irish names. There's nothing you can do about not being Irish, but maybe change your name to Adam or to Al as a nickname for the ballot just to make people more comfortable. And look, that sounds offensive and racist. But again, what I was talking about earlier about you have just seconds to convince someone that you understand them and that you'll fight for them. When you have an ethnic name, it's much harder. And even in comedically, AFTAB on a yard sign in Cincinnati, Ohio, 6 years ago, that didn't immediately occur to people that was a human being, right? It looked like an advertisement for a standardized test or a prescription drug, or famously an insurance company like Aflac. And so instead of running away from my name and my heritage, what I decided to do was just own it and just use that as a differentiator. And yeah, a healthy dose of self-deprecation and humor, that's reflective of me. I like to make people laugh, frankly. I like to deploy humor where I can. It's not always successful. And so I raised enough money to get on TV. And in my TV ads, every time I said my name, a big yellow duck puppet would pop up and say Aftab in the Aflac voice. And it was incredibly popular. It kind of spread like wildfire, kind of gave me name ID overnight. And on the strength of that ad and on all the organizing we had done, we shocked a lot of people by winning that race and becoming the first Democrat in 100 years. And the coda on that story is those same Democrats now come to me and say, Mayor, how am I going to run and win? My name is John Smith. How am I going to, stand out from the crowd? And so what used to be perceived as a political weakness, my name, there's only one Aftab in the state of Ohio. And so now people view it as a political strength. And I am really proud of that. But I will say I have mixed feelings about having to use self-deprecation to make people comfortable with my name. I'm proud of the ad. I wouldn't change a thing. But a part of me wishes I didn't have to do that, right? But when you're the first, you have to make concessions. And I'm hopeful that the next person who runs for countywide or runs for mayor who's AANHPI can just kind of focus on their qualifications and their experiences and their vision, and not have to make people comfortable with their name or their ethnicity.
Yeah, I mean that's a fair point that you bring up. By the way, for the audience who's never actually met you in person, I've been fortunate to meet you quite a few times in person. You during those 45 seconds, I would say in the first 5 seconds, you have an incredible I think, impression that you leave. You're 6'3". That's pretty tall for an Asian. That's like NBA level height. Okay. You got Robert Redford good looks. And
oh, wow. Okay. All right.
yeah, I'm making you embarrassed. I get it. Right. No, but what you do actually have, I think, is an incredibly warm smile, and it just invites people in. And it's very, how do we say this? It is something that is, it's very inviting. And so I think that helps a long ways, along with obviously, that makes people more open to listening to you. And you're incredibly self-deprecating in a way that makes people feel like they can speak with you, right? And that they can be genuine with you and authentic. And I think that's great. But you did talk about this idea, sometimes we have to do things that, quite frankly, are difficult, or they are things where we wish we wouldn't have to do. But I think what you're saying is so important. You did it, and part of your motivation is really trying to lay the groundwork for future leaders, so they may not have to do that. They can do other things. And so that type of sacrifice and the motivation behind that, I think, is incredibly important to sort of highlight and point out. So from the community, thank you. Right. Thank you so much. So let's talk about this. You are literally the only Democrat in this office, and you're dealing with a whole bunch of people who are pretty much, it was a Republican infrastructure, pretty much. Right? All the judges, there's like 20 some judges, and majority of them are all Republican. And they've been used to 100 years of having to deal with another Republican in terms of facilitating, I think, the logistics of court, right?
Yeah.
How did you actually break down those walls and build some bridges and actually get stuff done in that type of environment where you were, quite frankly, unwanted?
Yeah, it was some of the most stressful days of my public service career, because, again, first Democrat in 100 years, the whole courthouse is Republican. The courthouse was basically a patronage factory for Republican electeds. So not only were the electeds Republican, but all of the staff were basically activists. Not all the staff, but nearly all. And so I was the most disliked person in that office. even in that courtroom, even the 200 plus employees that I inherited, a lot of them just had no business being there. They were just patronage hires. I remember the HR chief was also the COO, was also the municipal chief, and the guy basically did nothing all day. And so it was really a test of not political leadership, but actual management and leadership to change the culture of that office within kind of a broken courthouse system, to inspire the employees of mine who deserved to be there, that I was not there to just fire everybody, but that there would be a transition process, very clearly articulate what that process would be. Everyone was going to apply and interview for their job. And if you were not qualified, or if you were not up to the standard that we were trying to place, that we were going to make a change. But not letting people sit in that limbo forever, and being very clear about, this is how it starts. This is the time period where it will end. Once it ends, then you're good, right? Then the transition period is over. And that's really hard. It's really hard when you have 200 people who are on pins and needles trying to work, but also worried that they're going to get fired. It's really hard to assemble a leadership team to manage the courthouse very, very quickly, bringing in people who'd never worked in the courthouse, but were, financial analyst experts or HR experts, and trusting them that they would learn the specific dynamics of the courthouse. A lot of it was me raising my hand and saying, man, I don't know this. Who would know the answer to this? And going to seek it out. That's one of the best pieces of advice I've ever had. Is it's not your role as a leader to be the smartest person in the room. It's your role as a leader to get access to the right information and put it in front of the right people. And there's something incredibly powerful when you're a leader of being vulnerable. Can't do it too much, because then you lose confidence, but to be vulnerable and say, I don't know the answer to this, or I'm not sure, which direction we should go. What do you guys think? It's really empowering, I've found. But to answer your question directly, yeah, it was really hard to build bridges within the courthouse with Republican judges. And as clerk of courts, I'm directly elected, to be sure, but so much of my job is dependent on what the judges want. And so if the judges wanted to just screw with me for the 5 years that I was there, they could have done that. But thankfully, because I had reached out individually, personally, not had a staff member do it, but go and knock on their door, introduce myself, ask for coffee. Now, not all of them took me up on it, but the ones that did saw that I was not interested in making their life harder. I was interested in professionalizing my office to make their life and the customer or the people interacting with the courthouse's life easier. And most importantly, I wasn't interested in credit. So there are so many programs and initiatives that we rolled out from my office that I didn't even take any credit for. I gave credit to the municipal court judges, or I gave credit to the common pleas judges. And after a couple of times of doing that, they realized that, some of them never got over the fact that they thought I, was just some kid. But a lot of them kind of came to realize that I was there to make people's lives better, and that I wasn't interested in partisan politics. I was just interested in doing a good job. And I've taken those lessons and applied them as mayor, because as mayor, I have to work collaboratively with a Republican senator, U.S. senator. I have to work collaboratively with an all Republican governor, attorney general, et cetera. A massive majorities in the state house for both the Senate and the representatives. So, in Ohio, it's not unusual for Democrats and Republicans to work together.
When I listened to how you dealt with what was conflict, it was conflict. When you came in, there was conflict with the staff, conflict with your key stakeholders. Let's call them the judges, right? And oftentimes in the Asian culture, we're told to sort of put our heads below the fray so that, we don't get involved in conflict. And in fact, it's not the way we resolve conflict is we kind of avoid it. And both you and I know that only tends to delay. And actually, if anything, it tends to make things worse because, the pressure builds up and it actually explodes, right? You dealt with it head on. And part of the idea of building bridges and being persuasive is actually having those difficult conversations, meeting people face to face, saying, this is what I'm about. And, and please understand where I'm coming from. And let me understand where you're coming from, and let's find some middle ground. But it's that hard work, right? And so it takes real conflict resolution skills, which I think you really demonstrated to build, I think, some of those bridges. And I think that's an important point for us to take away coming from an Asian heritage, is that when it comes to conflict, it's about addressing it. It is not about avoiding it.
I think that's right. There are times when I have to pick a fight, right? So when the Dobbs decision came down, I felt compelled to pick a fight about abortion access in my city and how I fundamentally disagreed with the governor and the state legislature. And so I was happy to pick that fight. There are times, though, when I'm as mayor, I could pick a fight every day. Like I could just be fighting all the time. And some of my predecessors kind of had that perspective. There are enough fights coming my way that I tend not to pick a fight unless I have to, because, the mayor's office really is right in the middle of everything, right? We are the convener. We are the place where people come to try and hammer out some kind of a compromise. And so none of the most effective mayors in the country are partisan. Now, I personally am very progressive, but Procter & Gamble, largest consumer products company in the world, is headquartered in Cincinnati. If I treated P&G the way DeSantis treated Disney, like I would be run out of town on a rail, right? And so mayors are just different. We've got to collaborate and work with everybody. And so it doesn't benefit me or, frankly, the city for me to just be hot-tempered and go looking for fights. But if a fight comes my way, oftentimes it can be, even for me, difficult to have the courage of my convictions. But you just kind of remind yourself, why are you here? What is in the best interest of the most people in Cincinnati? And if you're not willing to do it, to fight for it, then who is going to do it? And when you're mayor, the answer is nobody. And so that really pushes me forward and gives me more confidence when I have to take those fights. But I want your audience to know it's not easy. I don't enjoy getting into conflict. I don't, even though I'm a litigator and a mayor, a trained conflict person, it's not my favorite part of the job, but it absolutely is necessary, because to your point, if you don't engage proactively, the problem will either get bigger or it'll have significant negative consequences on the most vulnerable in your community.
During the height of the Asian hate crimes, I was left with a sense of disbelief and anger.
These feelings prompted me to write a Forbes article titled, "Who Owns the AAPI Brand?" It's clear that branding such a diverse community is difficult. Yet in the absence of a cohesive brand narrative, derogatory stereotypes and racial slurs were created. Fortunately, the AAPI community did come together and form TAF, the Asian American Foundation, to not only combat Asian hate, but to also share positive narratives that fight bias and promote belonging. TAF has launched numerous programs to support this effort, including the Iconic Podcast. Please visit TAF.org to learn more, and to subscribe to this podcast, please visit iconicpodcast.com. Join me in supporting TAF, because together we make a difference.
That's an important point you're bringing up, is that sometimes you have to pick a fight, but sometimes you have to go to the fight and turn it into something where you dance, right?
Yeah.
And so but you can't avoid it. That's the main point here.
Yeah.
Don't avoid it. And there are different ways to go into that fight, to either, to actually punch, but there are times when you can deflect and actually, if anything, encourage, right? So I think that's really very, very helpful for our listeners to understand this. I want to talk about when you decided to run for congressional office. You were at the Hamilton County and you were helping sort of facilitate all the stuff that happens in the courthouse. And it wasn't something where you sort of fell into it. You actually had an intention of saying, hey, I'm going to get some experience in public service, and then I'm going to then expand it in terms of the scope and reach of what I can do. And you ran for congressional office, but you lost, right? Yeah. And we all know how hard it is to go after something intentionally and the disappointment that comes from that. Talk about that. I mean, a lot of times, people don't want this point, so they avoid things, but you fully embrace the idea, I'm going after it. And in fact, the odds were kind of against you and you still went after it.
Yeah, it was, man, that was both some of the most inspiring and exciting parts of my career and absolutely the hardest. I will always be proud of the fact that I was part of the generation that stood up and ran against the xenophobia.
So let me frame this. You actually ran right after Trump was elected, right? Like 2 years after Trump was elected?
The night that my political career began, the night I won clerk of courts, was November of 2016, the same night that Donald Trump won. In 2018, the DCCC was looking for someone to run in Ohio's first congressional district. And they reached out to me after I made some headlines, given the fact that I shocked a lot of people by winning the clerk of courts. And, I decided to run primarily because of my mom's refugee background, my background having immigrant parents, and just the direction of the country. In 2018, we knew what Donald Trump was capable of. In 2016, we didn't necessarily know he was running for the first time. In 2018, we'd seen 2 years of chaos. And so it was an easy decision to run against him. In hindsight, I probably shouldn't have run. I was just a year into being clerk of courts. I was loving it. I was enacting a lot of change. I kind of got romanticized by the idea of being in Congress. I kind of got too focused on beating Trump and not necessarily focused on what I was going to do as a member of Congress, and ran an incredibly exciting and to many inspiring campaign, but fell just a little bit short. To your point, it was gerrymandered R+7, I think, and we narrowed the margin significantly.
Just so folks understand what that means, is that was a district that was drawn up in a way where it was incredibly Republican, correct?
Yeah, very, very Republican. So a traditional Republican versus a traditional Democrat, the Republican would win by 7 points. We narrowed the margin, ran a really strong campaign that I'm proud of, but lost. And to your point, when you lose that publicly after pouring your heart and soul and your entire person into a race, it is hard. It took me a couple months to bounce back. I mean, I just felt so empty and so defeated, and the public nature of it is also, really hard to deal with. It's one thing to run and win publicly. It's another thing to lose so publicly, because it was a national race.
And was that your first time losing a actual race?
Yeah.
Okay, so
first
you were
time.
already what, 30 at the time, 30 something, and that was
Yeah.
a big awakening, huh?
It was tough. It was tough. And like, it was hard to move on from because, and everybody's just trying to be nice, but people for months afterwards would see me in the street and say, hey, get him next time, or you ran such a great campaign. And they were just trying to be nice, but it would just take me right back into that headspace that I was trying to kind of move on from. And so it was, a lot of people wanted me to run for Congress again in 2020. And, just given the experience, I decided to just run for reelection for the clerk of court's office. And I was anticipating running for Congress again in 22 because the district had been redrawn and was less gerrymandered. And I was preparing to do that. But then the reason I'm an accidental mayor is because the person who was supposed to be mayor, a council member at the time, the massive front runner, got indicted for public corruption by the FBI. And so that happened, I think, January of 21, left a massive vacuum of leadership in the city, particularly at a time when the city needed leadership with the pandemic and all of the challenges that brought, and George Floyd. And so a mentor and a former mayor kind of sat me down and told me that I had to run for the good of the city. And I was apprehensive because, look, no shots to legislators, no shots to anybody else. But being mayor is a real damn job, right? Like it is like you have to make sure the trash is getting picked up. You have to make sure that the snow is getting plowed. You have to make sure that the streets are safe. If there's a shooting in Cincinnati, people don't expect the mayor to have a hearing or give a speech. They expect the mayor to go apprehend the suspect and make sure it never happens again. And so it's an intimidating office. It's probably the best and most challenging office in politics at the local level. And so I was really intimidated and scared by the responsibility and the burden. But after conversations with my family and friends, ultimately decided to jump in.
We'll talk about you being mayor and that whole transition. I think it's interesting. But one of the things we do want to talk about for the audience is the idea when you hit your low point. Was losing really your low point, or was there something else? Like, I know running is pretty difficult. I know you're a public figure now, and that comes with a lot of trolling, which is not just on you, but sometimes your friends, your family. Talk about, the idea of, sure, there's disappointment in that headspace. Was there other moments that were equally difficult for you in public life, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I think what is true for me and so many other AA and HPI electeds is that every single race I've ever run in, whether it's junior high, college, clerk of courts, Congress, mayor, I have experienced overt racism. And as opposed to other communities, there is no organization to call out racism against AA and HPI electeds or candidates and hold people accountable.
There
and
now is with TAF.
Right.
Now, but back then there wasn't, right? Back then there was not.
Now there is, yeah. But it's just really hard for the candidate or the elected to do it, because if you call something racist, you're immediately accused of playing the race card, and then the conversation isn't about whether that it's wrong that the comment or post is racist. The conversation is about whether it actually is racist or whether the candidate or elected is just being sensitive. And I'm not talking about, implicit bias. I'm talking about when I ran for Congress, Paul Ryan's super PAC spent millions of dollars on a TV ad calling me a Libyan terrorist. So this is not like gray area stuff. This is just straight up racism.
They straight out called you a Libyan terrorist.
Yeah. And so
you have no Libyan background. So that's. But by the way, I also read that early on in your career, one of your opponents actually had a campaign slogan, "Vote for the American candidate."
Yeah.
So meaning that you weren't American, right?
Yeah, stuff like that happens all the time, and nobody says a word, and the candidate can't necessarily do it either. And so that is really, really hard, particularly, when you're, as you mentioned, Cincinnati has an AAPI population of about 2.5%. And so it can feel really isolating and feel really lonely when that's happening. The other aspect of it is just the impact on your family. When you lose, obviously you take the brunt of it, but your wife or husband also has to deal with all the comments and the well-meaning people who keep bringing it up. But I think the low point for me wasn't the losing. It was the realization that I had essentially ignored everything in my life for the past year, devoted to this one thing. And that sacrifice was massive. And it was because I lost, not necessarily for anything. Now, that's a very cynical way of viewing it. Obviously, there are a lot of benefits that came from that campaign, particularly the fact that the Republicans had to spend so much money on my race, and that diverted resources away from other Democrats who were ultimately successful, and we won back a majority in the House. But taking the time to reevaluate how much time I was spending on politics versus my family and friends, and versus just taking care of myself, was a big wake up call. Because the character flaw for me is that I get insanely competitive. And so I can kind of lose myself in whatever I'm competing on now, whether that's triathlons or politics. And after that race, the low point was realizing just how much I had sacrificed and how much I had unilaterally sacrificed, not consulting my friends or anybody else, but just deciding to focus entirely on this, and how wrong that was. And so one of the lessons moving forward is that I'm still insanely competitive, but I really do try to be very intentional about having some kind of balance in my life, particularly now that I have kids, because I just can't afford to do that again.
Wow, that's so powerful. What you talked about, this idea of sometimes we lose ourselves in ourselves, right? And you did that for a whole year, and the intentionality, or it's not the intentionality, the goal of losing yourself was to win, right? And you didn't, right? So it was like double whammy, like, I lost myself, and then boom, I didn't even win. Okay, so double whammy. So this is going to seem really strange, but I'm going to ask you, okay, in the context of how difficult it is to be both a candidate and then eventually the actual elected official, right? In terms of you always have to be on. It's incredibly physically and emotionally draining and demanding. And our parents are generally going to be against it, and so there's all these reasons, and there's just not a lot of role models in terms of AAPI leaders who we can go to. Why in the hell would anybody, or should anybody, consider running for office? I want you to give us that pitch, given what we just talked about.
I can't imagine a more fulfilling life or a more impactful career. I mean, that's ultimately why I do it. I do it because I don't know if it's ingrained in me because of my parents or just my life experiences, but I want my life and my career to matter. And the way I judge whether it matters is whether I am a good father and husband, and whether I'm leaving some kind of legacy of positive change in my wake. And in order to have the biggest impact in your community, running for office, no matter how small or local of an office, affords you not only that opportunity, but that responsibility, that burden. And it is in some ways a burden to use the very small amount of time you have left, or that you are given in elected office, to every second try to be crushing it to make people's lives better. That's what I get to do every single day. Like, I'm so lucky. I'm so lucky that every morning what I'm doing is trying to think through, how do we build more housing? How do we create more jobs? How do we get more guns off the street? How do we brag about the incredible success of Cincinnati to attract more people here? I mean, like, that's so cool. So I feel like the job and the role kind of sells itself. Yeah, there are sacrifices. You don't make as much money. You have to take on a lot of public criticism. There's a lot of online bullying that happens, but it pales in comparison to the ability. We just passed zoning reform, which is incredibly bureaucratic and very kind of local government nerdy and probably boring. But by changing zoning in Cincinnati across the city, we have essentially redesigned the city for the next 100 years. We have legalized housing. We've legalized dense neighborhood business districts. We've prioritized public transportation, just like our forefathers tried to prevent the white flight in the 70s by creating suburbs inside the city. We have redesigned the city to return it back to an actual city, which will actually help people find more housing and find more jobs. That's crazy. I'm just a guy. And I got an opportunity to do that. For the next 100 years, the city will be following these rules on what you can build and where. And we've tried to do it in a way that's equitable. When people talk about systemic reforms, they often talk about, our jails and our legal systems. There's systemic inequities all over the place. You have the same opportunity to make that generational change at your school board. So to me, the question is, why wouldn't you do it? It's why aren't you doing it? If you have the talent and the willpower to step into the arena, you don't just owe it to yourself, you owe it to your community to exert as much talent and effort that you can, because the people who you disagree with, they're doing that. They're going and running for school boards and talking about crazy stuff like CRT. They're running for state legislature. They're running for clerks of courts so that they can manipulate our elections. The other side is doing this. We desperately need. Look, if you want to run for Congress, Senate, whatever. There's a lot of people who can help you do that. I want to help you run for something local, because frankly, that's the governance that actually matters, right? That's the stuff that people actually care about and can acutely impact people's lives. And so I love what I do. I love the opportunity I have every day. There are parts of it that are hard. Absolutely. It's a very demanding career, but man, I wouldn't change it for the world.
What a sell. And I'm sold. I love what you said there, that it matters. At the end of the day, it matters. And everyone that I met at the AAPI lead, which are all the elected officials, when I ask them the same question, they say the first thing that comes out of their mouth is, I love what I do. And for all of you listening, if you don't love what you do, here is a great opportunity to get involved on something that matters, and you're going to love what you do. So what a great reason to do it. But I really also think the other thing that I want to thank you for, Mayor Aftab, is this idea that you are laying the groundwork for future generations, right? And I think that in itself is going to have incredible impacts. I want to end on this note. Thank you so much for your time today. Before we leave, I just want to ask you one last question, which is,
sure,
are there other guests we should be inviting that you've met along this journey who you think would be really inspirational and helpful for our listeners to hear their stories?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm biased. I love my mayors. Ron Nuremberg is the mayor of San Antonio, one of the largest cities in the country. Millions of people live in San Antonio. Bruce Harrell, mayor of Seattle, half Black, half Japanese. Just a fascinating story. Seattle is one of those cities that is just so transformational in so many ways, but also has unique challenges. Mayor Wu, I think Michelle Wu of Boston is probably the most well-known Asian mayor in the country, and for good reason. She is just so talented and so thoughtful as a leader. She's really someone that I admire and try to emulate. Mayor Glory of San Diego is probably the smartest person I know on immigration, because he's dealing with it at a local level every single day and has really important insights. I think any one of those mayors would be a fantastic guest. My favorite Congress person is Grace Meng out of New York. She's been a huge advocate of not just Asian leadership at the national level, but she's really created a ladder for people like me and others to walk in her path. I think William Tong at a statewide level is just the Attorney General of Connecticut is just someone who every single day is not just fighting for his state, but fighting for AA and HPIs nationally. So those are the folks that kind of come to mind. And lastly, David Chu, the city solicitor of San Francisco, he's making a lot of national news because he's fighting back against AI pornography that unfortunately has been affecting a lot of young people in our community. So there's a brief list.
That's a brief list. And you know what's so exciting for our listeners is We have so many stories to both tell and to share and to learn from and to connect us to our community. Thank you so much, Mayor Aftab, for being part of this and for giving back to our community through this podcast.
Thanks so much.
Listen to all episodes of Aconic on aconicpodcast.com. You can also catch new episodes on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.